The ranch house was, but there was a piece here and a piece there and a piece there, and a neighbor here. And what did old Chauncey do? He fenced the whole dang thing in, neighbors and all. Well, it didn't go over too well with the family by the name of Barry. And one of the Barrys had been shooting some of the livestock, particularly the prize bulls that old Chauncey had brought in. Feelings were kind of bad anyway, and it finally erupted into a shooting affair. Well, the Dewey hands got the best of it. The Dewey hands killed 3 of the Barry family and were promptly arrested and charged with murder. And they had to change venue because the feeling was so high against Chauncey and his hands. So they had the trial, and they found them not guilty. As a matter of fact, the Barry hands drew the first weapons and fired the first shots. So it really wasn't much of a choice there. But the people out there didn't see it that way. They hung the jury in effigy, and they made up a song. I won't try to sing it, I couldn't sing it if I tried to anyway, about the dastardly Deweys. Very unpopular verdict. Well, the only thing that C.P. Dewey, the old man, and Chauncey were found guilty of over that affair was illegal fencing. And they were given a sentence of 1 day in jail. Neither of which served the 1 day in jail, for that matter. But later on, Chauncey was charged with unlawful death. Does that sound familiar? A fellow by the name of O.J. Simpson went through that. He was found guilty of wrongful death and fined $10,000. Well, what do you think his answer to that would be? Old Chauncey, C.P. knew how to make money, and Chauncey knew how to spend it. His answer to that $10,000 fine was, "The hell with you, I'm going to leave." So he went back to Chicago, where he still had his registration and so on. He was still a resident of Chicago, so they couldn't enforce the $10,000 fine. But he didn't stay away very long. He apparently got his hands on some money, came back to Kansas, paid off his fine, and started ranching the Dewey Ranch in eastern Kansas, well, down the road here. 2 of Chauncey's sons are still living on the ranch out in western Kansas. I've talked to one of them, the other one won't talk to people. But Chauncey was something else. He went through the Dewey fortune, and in 1930, the Dewey Ranch here in Riley and Gary counties was sold as a sheriff's sale to pay off money that he owed. There is just one piece of property that was on the Dewey Ranch that is not on Konza. And you can't see it here, but it's located right in this area. It was originally settled by a fellow by the name of Jacobus, if that's the right pronunciation, I'm not sure. J-A-C-O-B-U-S. Chauncey bought that piece in his own name, and everything else was in the Dewey Cattle Company name. So when they sold it at sheriff's sale, they didn't sell that particular piece. He sold it and got the money for that. Okay, so that takes care of, pretty much takes care of the Dewey. Well, not quite. C.P. Dewey, the old man, died in 1904. The Eureka Lake Resort that I mentioned was opened in 1900. In 1903, which is when the feud took place out in western Kansas, in 1903 there was a big flood here, and Crescent Lake filled in. And water came up to almost the bottom of the second floor in the big resort. That was 1903, a bad year for CP. The following year he died. A trip to West Virginia to see some doctors. While he was seeing the doctors, he died. His widow got just what legally she had to have, and after a few small amounts that were given to various people, everything else was left to Chauncey, and that's when he started going through the money and ended up having to sell. So that takes care of the Deweys. Any questions about the Deweys?
How many acres did they have here?
About 11,000. But what is on Konza now is about 8,600, because Konza only goes to the interstate. And the Dewey Ranch extended some south of the interstate.
Charlie?
Yes.
Didn't the shootout start over the Dewey's going to pick up a stock tank?
That's exactly right.
Berries that they had bought at an auction?
The berries weren't very well off, and they also had to have a sheriff's sale, and at that sheriff's sale, one of the Dewey hands bought a wooden stock tank. I mean, it was nothing to get really excited about.
$15, I remember.
I don't remember what it was. I have it written down in someplace, but it was practically, it was little, very little. But he couldn't carry it home with him that day. So the next day they came back, the Dewey hands came back with a wagon to pick up the stock tank. That's when the shooting started.
And didn't the flood of '03 change a lot of what the Deweys owned? The location of the river when it changed, it made a lot of difference in their property.
Not a lot of difference in the property itself, the way the property was used. But yeah, when, and it wasn't that flood that cut off Hunter's Island either. It was a later flood that cut off Hunter's Island and took out the bridge.
But the way I understood it out there where the, what we always call the Oddfellow home, that's where they took that land and put it on the north side of the river instead of the south side.
That's exactly right. It used to make a big loop up there and it cut through. They reopened the resort, Chauncey did. His dad was already dead by then. They reopened the resort, and it never did do much after that. In 1916, the remaining buildings burned down, and it was sold to Oddfellows, and became the Oddfellows home, the IOF home. Let's see, there was something else I was going to say about Chauncey. I have a lot of bad things to say about Chauncey if I can just remember all of them. Oh yeah, I'll come to that in a minute.
Well, having a name like Chauncey is like being a boy named Sue, isn't it?
Oddly enough, Chauncey is not an unusual name for late 1800s.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the next fellow I'm going to talk about is totally different from either C.P. Dewey or Chauncey Dewey. Have you ever heard of Owen Dix, D-I-X? Or have you heard of the Dix edition? Yeah. Owen Dix came here in 1859 and started working for a fellow out on McDowell Creek. And then very shortly, Owen Dix rented 1,840 acres, and I haven't been able to find out exactly where, but it was somewhere on McDowell Creek. And he did a pretty good job of farming that 1,840 acres. But then he decided, why rent when I ought to be able to buy some on my own? So he started buying property, and the property he bought was on what is now Konza. He would buy 40 acres here, 40 acres there, 160, whatever came up. And then he started selling it because he couldn't get a big enough piece in one piece. to pay him to try to raise cattle on it or anything like that. So he would sell. He was a businessman, believe me. He would buy and sell and buy and sell, rent if he had to. He made money. But then about, I think it was around 1918, he decided it would be easier for him to live in the Fairmont addition and run a dairy farm. And he's the one that made butter his specialty. In 1 year, they produced about 5,000 pounds of butter, and they would take it into Manhattan by horse-drawn wagon and sell it off the wagon, or sell it to merchants or wherever they could sell it. Well, after he got a little older, he moved his family up to the Strong community. Are you familiar with where the Strong community is? Up north? And that's where the Dix addition is. Owen Dix didn't build that addition. It was his son Harvey. And there's still a Harvey Street up there, and a couple of other streets named for the Dix family. But Owen Dix was responsible for being the intermediary for quite a number of the people that lived out on what is now Konza. Okay, that takes care of person number 2. When Chauncey took over the ranch, he didn't want to run it himself. He didn't know anything about it anyway. So he hired a fellow by the name of Wes Dawkins. Have any of you heard of the Dawkins family? There's still a woman who lives just down south on Manhattan Avenue, whose husband was Earl Dawkins, and he was the son of Wes Dawkins, who was the foreman that Chauncey Dewey hired. He was one of the foremen that Chauncey Dewey hired. They had a foreman for the agricultural part of the farm, or ranch, and they had a foreman for the livestock. And who was the foreman for the livestock? Someone I just talked to before.
O'Neill.
O'Neill. John Red O'Neill. And Wes Dawkins and his family lived in the main house, which would be located about right in here. The house was built in 1912, the barn in 1911. And Wes Dawkins and his family lived in the big stone house that's there now. John O'Neill lived out here. This says that Henry Moffett was the first person to own that, and he was. How did you get possession of land then, keeping in mind that in 1862 there were 3 legislative acts passed by Congress? What were they? Homestead was one of them. That was the first one. That was passed in May of 1862. The second one was something called the Morrill Act. Not M-O-R-A-L. M-O-R-R-I-L-L. What was the Morrill Act? Beg pardon? University land grant. And the language of that law said, for every loyal state, what was happening then as far as the U.S. was concerned? Civil War. For every loyal state, 30,000 acres of public land would be granted to them for the purposes of forming an agricultural university. Well, Kansas was a loyal state. They got 30,000 acres. The third act that was passed that year was called the Railroad Act. What was the Railroad